and they told me the base had stopped responding. That phrasing stuck with me longer than it should have. Bases don't usually stop responding. They lose power, they go offline, they get locked down. There's almost always a word from what's wrong with them, something procedural you can hang a report on. But this didn't have that. I arrived at Fort Arrowhead at 0217 hours. The installation was still powered, perimeter lights glowing steadily along the fence line and throwing long, orderly shadows across the access road. The gate arm was raised and locked in place, like it had been cleared for entry and never reset. No guards were posted. I stayed outside the wire longer than necessary, not because anything looked wrong, but because nothing did. The fence was intact, no breaches or disturbed gravel, and the towers were lit but unmanned, their optics still sweeping slow arcs over empty ground as if they were running on habit alone. Nothing moved, no alarm sounded, even the flags hung slack in the still air. Everything looked operational. That was the first problem. I didn't go through the gate right away. I stood there and listened, because places like this always have a sound to them when they're alive. Generators cycling, distant vehicles, a door somewhere opening and closing. Fort Arrowhead had electricity, but it didn't have that underlying noise. The quiet felt maintained, not abandoned, and that was harder to place. The guard shack door was unlocked. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of stale coffee and electronics that had been running too long. The logbook lay open on the desk, the last entry neat and routine, timestamps evenly spaced and unremarkable. A paper cup sat beside it. The cigarette had burned itself down in an ashtray and gone out on its own. Ordinary details, the kind that suggests someone stepped away briefly and intended to come back. I keyed my radio out of habit. MP Redding on site, beginning initial assessment. Static answered. Thin, even, continuous. That mattered. Static meant the path still existed. Power, antenna, basic function. But it didn't mean anyone was listening. I logged it mentally and stepped back outside. Crossing the gate felt like stepping into a photograph. Everything inside the perimeter looked sharply defined. Edges too clean, shadows too still, as if the base had been paused mid-operation and left that way. Road markings were bright, signage unweathered, buildings intact. The grass along the curb line wasn't overgrown, but it wasn't freshly maintained either. It sat in that narrow margin where time had passed without leaving obvious marks, which bothered me more than neglect would have. The barracks lights were on. Doors stood open. I cleared the first building room by room, keeping my attention on what I could verify instead of what I expected to find. Beds were made tight, lockers stood open with personal items still inside, letters stacked neatly, family photos taped to locker doors and curling slightly at the corners. Boot racks were partially empty, not scattered, but selective. Cold weather gear was missing from several lockers. Radios were signed out on the equipment sheet near the door, each entry complete, each signature legible. In real emergencies, paperwork is one of the first things people forget. Here, it had been done carefully. Rifles leaned against the far wall, loaded, not abandoned in a hurry or staged for a show, just set down as if whoever carried them planned to pick them up again after finishing something else. The next barracks told the same story. Different handwriting, different faces in the photos. The same quiet omissions repeating themselves with uncomfortable consistency. It wasn't that everyone left at once. It was that everyone left the same way. Outside, the base remained still, low, electrical hum never changing. I found myself listening for something to interrupt it. A door, a voice, a vehicle starting up, but nothing did. And the absence began to feel deliberate. I moved toward the motor pool. Vehicles sat parked in clean rows, engines cold, maintenance tags current. Tool carts stood where they'd been left, not overturned or pushed aside. One Humvee sat slightly out of alignment, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. Boot prints led away from it. Regulation tread, even spacing, a steady pace that didn't suggest urgency or hesitation. They didn't scatter or overlap, and there was no sign of a struggle or a hurry. I followed the track across the concrete, careful not to step into it. Near a service corridor between two structures, the pattern changed. Just once. One print sat slightly out of alignment. Not enough to break stride, not enough to suggest a misstep. The spacing before and after it remained consistent, as if the deviation had been noticed and accounted for. It looked corrected. I didn't have better language for it at the time. There were no drag marks, no uneven pressure, nothing to indicate injury, just a single adjustment surrounded by precision. The rest of the track merged with other identical sets near the corridor. Same tread, same spacing, same cadence. From that point on, the individual tracks stopped standing out, not because it disappeared, but because it matched. I stood there longer than necessary, looking back at that single print. I couldn't explain why it bothered me, only that everything else on the base seemed too exact to leave something like that unresolved. I logged to the location and moved on. Command was quiet. Inside, papers lay across desks and floors, not thrown, but dropped. Chairs slightly askew as if people had stood up and just never sat back down. The air had the closed, conditioned feel of a building whose systems were still running for no one in particular. And then I noticed a clock. A wall clock ticked steadily on the far side of the room, and in the absence of any other sound, it felt louder than it should have. Each tick marked time passing in a place that didn't seem to be using it for anything. Maps lined the walls. Each one showed the base perimeter circled again and again. Some markings were light and neat, others retraced the same line until the surface beneath had worn smooth. There were no routes outward, no search grids, no branching plans, just the boundary, reinforced over and over. The operations monitors were still on. Security feeds showed personnel across the base, not gathered or fleeing, but positioned. One stood in a utility corridor facing the wall, hands at his sides. Another stood beside a relay panel, posture straight, feet aligned. One sat at a small desk, shoulders squared, head angled down towards some paperwork. None of them moved. None appeared distressed. They weren't frozen mid-gesture, they looked placed. I recognized one face immediately, Lieutenant Harris. He'd been listed as missing for 7 days. On the screen, his posture was exact, back straight, feet aligned, eyes forward. He didn't look injured or exhausted, he looked like he was waiting. I keyed the radio. Base operations, this is MP Redding. Identify. Static. Then voices came through, layered and calm, overlapping, just enough to blur together. Standing by, at assigned position, holding per instruction. After a brief pause, one voice cut through clearly. Status remains acceptable. And then, mixed among them, my name. Redding. It wasn't urgent, I wasn't confused. It sounded like a roster check. I held still, surprised despite myself. The way my name came back didn't sound like a reply at all. It sounded indexed, like my presence had been acknowledged rather than addressed. I keyed up again. Repeat, who just identified me? Static swallowed the response. Training said verify. Instinct said leave. I chose training, even as the choice sat heavier than it should have. Identify your station. Identify supervisor. The radio crackled, several voices rising at once before collapsing back into noise. On the monitors, Harris didn't move. None of them did. I stepped closer to the console and pulled up system menus, looking for dropped frames, time-stamped anomalies, anything that would explain what I was seeing. The feeds were clean, the timestamps were normal. Whatever this was, it wasn't a malfunction. It was coverage. Too centered, too careful, like the base was proud of how well it was doing. I stepped back and didn't realize I'd stopped moving until I was standing in the doorway. Outside, the perimeter lights flickered once, then went steady again. Not a power surge, not even a relay click, just a brief blink across the line. I slowed myself down and separated what I knew from what I felt. The base had power, security systems were active, personnel were present on camera. Communications wasn't reaching outside. That was enough to justify escalation. I turned away from the console and took one step from it. Behind me, a monitor refreshed. I hadn't touched the controls. The feed shifted to an interior corridor I hadn't accessed yet. Empty, perfectly framed. I stepped into the doorway. The feed changed again. When I looked, another interior angle, centered precisely. I stepped back. It reverted. No logs showed manual input, no automated sweep scheduled. Everything reported normal operation. I tested it, because that's what you do when a system behaves strangely. You assume bad automation before intent. I stepped out. The feed changed. When I stepped back in, it reverted. I stepped to my left. It changed again. Same framing every time. Same corridor width, same empty floor. I checked the camera ID numbers in the corner of the feeds. They weren't sequential. This wasn't a sweep, it was selection. I leaned in, watching for compression artifacts or repeated frames that would suggest recorded loops, but the feeds were live. When I stepped back again, the feed shifted closer to the building I was just in, centered on a junction I hadn't walked yet. That was when I stopped trying to convince myself it was random. From a systems standpoint, it looked like the base was reallocating attention. I made a note to flag the behavior during escalation and turned toward the hallway. Behind me, the monitor settled on a single interior feed and stopped changing. The corridor was empty, the framing exact, centered on a space just large enough for one person to stand. I stared at it longer than I should have, because my mind wanted to do what it always does, fit the world into something familiar. Camera systems don't prepare, they don't make room, they follow rules. I didn't know what rule I was looking at, but I knew the base had started accounting for me. I keyed the radio again, not because I expected an answer, but because silence has weight and I needed something to push against it. MP Reading to command, do you read? Static. Then, faintly, layered beneath it, a voice that sounded neither confused nor afraid. Standing by. I lowered the radio and looked back at the screen. The empty corridor remained centered, waiting, and the clock in the operations room kept ticking, steady and indifferent, as if time itself had been assigned.